Kia ora. Thank you for coming along to this webinar. My name is Isabel Oldfield. I'm the manager of the Wastewater and Stormwater Policy team. You'll also hear from Bella Whittle, who's the manager of the Systems Reporting team, Eddie Winter, who's a senior policy advisor, and Ed Young, who's one of our senior technical advisors. Go next slide. So we'll start with our whakatauki. Ko te waiaho, ko aho te wai, he whakaturanga tātou nō te wai. Ko te ora te wai, ko te ora o te tangata, he teonga te wai me te aki, ko wai tātou, ko wai tātou. So that whakatauki speaks to the importance of water and drives what we're doing today. So here's a quick list of what we'll cover today. So this webinar is specifically focused on the new measures that we've introduced and what you'll need to report on this year. We will have a further webinar in July that will talk to the data reporting tool we've created to report this data. And we'll also have a webinar in the next few weeks on this year's Network Environmental Performance Report and the key findings and lessons learned from that. But this one, if you could keep your questions specific to the new measures for this webinar. Next slide. So as you may be aware from participating this year, the Water Services Act requires that certain network operators provide us data so that we can understand the environmental performance of networks and summarise that understanding in an annual report. So the requirements apply to councils, council-controlled organisations, government departments, and the New Zealand Defence Force. So we started with the first set of measures in 2022, and we are just finishing off writing the report that summarises that data. We will now be looking to collect data for the additional drinking water measures that we introduced in 2023, as well as some new wastewater measures, and that will be summarised in a report that we will publish in early 2025. And then we also have introduced some wastewater measures that need to start being recorded from the 1st of July this year and reported at the end of next year for our third Network Environmental Performance Report. Next slide, please. So the purpose of this is to shine a light on the environmental performance of networks and network operators. We've developed 5 outcomes which guide the data that we collect. So the link between environmental performance and the impacts on environment and public health are clear, but we also consider that efficiency, reliability, resilience, and economic sustainability are really important components of environmental performance. So that's outlined in this slide, and that detail is also outlined in our Network Environmental Performance Report, which we publish shortly. Next slide. So this just gives a summary of some of the things I've already talked about. So we are just finishing writing the report that covered the last financial year. We are about to start asking you to collect your data for the financial year that we're currently in. And then we've also introduced measures for next financial year as well, which will go into our third report. So once we will be providing an embargo copy of our report 24 hours before public release, and then we'll do a further webinar to talk about the findings of that report in early July. And further later in July, then we will talk about the public reporting tool that we've developed so that you can provide your data to us. And I'll now pass over to Eddie to go through the drinking water measures.
Kia ora, kia ora koutou katoa. Thank you, Isabel, for that introduction. So we'll talk a little bit here about the drinking measures. So what is a drinking water network? There's a definition of the Act, but the definition we've included there as a guidance document talks about drinking water supply with all the elements comprising a system from end to end, from abstraction, treatment and delivery to consumers within that network. So network operators, being councils, council-controlled organisations or government departments and NZDF, need to provide data about those drinking water networks, with the exception of networks that have a peak population of less than 100 people or networks that are sourced from rainwater collection tanks only. Also, given the nature of government departments and the Defence Force, there are some measures which are not applicable, so they don't need to report on them. As we go through the next slides, we'll see some things are highlighted in blue. As today we've got a fairly small group, feel free to pop any questions in the chat as you go. There will be a Q&A session at the end, and some more people may join us later throughout the webinar. But feel free to pop your questions in those chats as we go, if you've got specific questions, and we'll probably be able to deal with them as we go rather than have to wait till the end. So if we talk a little bit more about what those measures are and what they look like. On the next slide, there are a number of drinking water measures that were introduced in 22 that operators have already reported on. So as Isabel talked about, the information has been grouped into the environmental impacts, the sustainability and economic. So those titles are included against all of those measures. And if you look at the measures and guidance document, which is available on the website, there's the latest version there for reference is the June 24 version. This includes all the drinking water measures which were previously in place, plus the new ones which were adopted in 23, plus the wastewater measures which we're looking to introduce from 1 July this year. So they're grouped by the outcomes, the measures. There's a reference code just so when you're trawling through the guide, you can look for DA7 is drinking water assets relating to measurement number 7, which is a drinking water network source type. There are detailed definitions for each one of these things in the guide. Also, there's a summary guide. So if you don't have to read through the whole way through the document, if you want a quick, easy reference guide, this table is produced just in a Word document available on the website. So all these documents are on the website. If you go to Taumata Arowai, there's a page which talks about measures, which has got all this information: what, why, when, how. So that's detailed in the guides. And on 1 July, we will put up an Excel template, which you can then download, complete, and send it back to us with all this data. Some of these measures are reported at an organisation wide. So if you're DOC, you will report across the whole of the Department of Conservation for certain measures. Some of the measures go down to an individual network. So where we've got that column at the end there of that table, some measures are reported at an organisation. So that's across the whole of the council, whole of the government department. The number of drinking water abstraction points, we want to know per network. So there's a little bit more granularity that breaks down how those measures are reported, either at a whole level or down at individual levels. So all of those in black there are measures that are currently in place. So thank you for already providing information for last year's report. But for next year's report, we'd want this information. And on the next slide, there are some new measures. So the ones in green there are the new measures. For instance, have consent conditions been met for the rate and take and volume of abstraction? So previously we've asked for some high level information about resource consents, but we're drilling down into the next level of what is the rate and what is the volume, the overall volume across the year. So when you provide this information in the template, it gives you some guidance towards how these are done. So there are things like what is the consented rate of take in litres per second, or the total amount in cubic meters per day or per year. Key thing there to look at are the units of measure. Every measurement has a unit of measure, and it's quite important to make sure that you're reporting using the right measure. When we come to things like lengths of pipes, there were different ways of measuring this last year. So some people provided the information in kilometers of pipes. Some people provide it in meters. So obviously one was 1,000 times bigger than the other. So when we looked at some of the data, there were a couple of apparent errors where people may have used the incorrect unit. Things like pressure, we use kilopascals, not bars, not mercury, not so there are different units that people can use, but we're very specific in the units that we use. Either they're kind of SI metric units, or for things like sludge, where you have trucks that take away sludge from drinking water treatment. Those trucks would usually go over a weighbridge before going to landfill. So the weighbridge in tons is the figure that we'd be using there. Or the volume for backwash water is usually measured in the volume in cubic meters, again, per year. So please be aware of those units and provide the information against those. Some of the questions are a yes, no. So if we look at fish passage, has an assessment made of all water takes where fish passage is impeded within a natural water body? That's a yes, no question. So for this network, you might say yes, and there's always an opportunity to provide more comments. So if there's anything there you want to allude to give us a little bit more of an explanation rather than just a yes, no, there's always a comment field. And against each one of these measures, there's also a confidence. So your degree of confidence could go from absolutely robust, we've got processes in place which can tell us this, to 13 decimal places, to mostly confident, to it's the best guess I can give you. And we acknowledge that different recording processes and reporting processes may have degrees of confidence. So we acknowledge that this may be a new process for some network operators. Some people have been providing this data to Water NZ for a number of years. They used to produce the National Performance Review going back to 2007, and a lot of these measures are based on that. So some of the council operators may be familiar and comfortable with reporting against those, others not so. So we acknowledge that your reporting processes may be less confident, and obviously over time that's an area where there's an opportunity for you to put processes in place to increase your level of confidence, because this is a public report. So very briefly, just looking at those measures there, as I say, if you've got any questions, pop them in the chat as we go, and we'll try and answer your questions throughout the presentation. So the next slide there, again, there are a couple of new measures there. So previously we've asked for the average time or the median time to attend an urgent fault or a non-urgent fault. We're now also looking at things like unplanned interruptions and the number of urban service connections that experience an unplanned interruption for greater than 8 hours. Also, things like service level pressures. We previously asked, do you have one? Now we're asking for details about what the reference level of pressure is, if it's set, and the number of properties which are operating below that. Again, some of these measures will apply to all, some will apply more to councils possibly than government departments. And if we look at the next slide, yes, so a number of these measures on the next slide here. So for instance, drinking water network losses is something that everyone reports either at a network or at a organizational level. Things like medium residential water consumption. Obviously, government departments are not operating residential homes in the same way. So the measures highlighted in blue there with a little star next to them, DRE4, DRE6 and 7, talking about residential and non-residential connections. This is not applicable for government departments, so we're not asking you to provide that detail. The green measures there are new measures that we're asking you to report on. So number of extraction points with meters installed and the frequency that those abstraction meters are either calibrated or verified. That would usually be following the manufacturer's guidelines, or if as part of your regional plan, there are requirements to calibrate abstraction meters on a periodic basis. And the days and the way in which that information is tracked. Is it a manual clipboard process, or is it a telemetry system that's tracking that data? Another round of new measures there, looking at alternative water uses. So a number of suppliers are looking at how water can be either recycled back into the treatment process or can be provided to residential and non-residential customers. Could be fed back into recharge aquifers, or it could be used in other parts of the network. And also stormwater can be used where it's appropriate there. So there are some new measures there in green. Again, the blue measures are not necessarily required for councils. Helen, did you have a question? Did you want to pop it in the chat while we're not sure if we can So Helen, if you had a question, did you want to pop it in the chat and we can answer that hopefully as we go? We'll just stay on the slide for a moment. So Helen's got a question there about capturing recycled water on a golf course for irrigation purposes. So we've seen a lot of overseas examples, particularly in Australia, where water can be used for any number of different purposes. It doesn't necessarily have to be potable quality water. So I know the Australians have a number of purple pipe schemes where water, which is used for irrigation, either in domestic use or for For example, irrigation or golf courses. There are a number of those schemes around the world where water is being used for different purposes and having purple pipes for non-potable use, such as irrigation. And we're seeing more and more of that happening as water use is increasing, particularly with the impacts of climate change. So if you do have any programs that look to reuse either stormwater or backwash water, we're trying to capture information about that wherever possible to provide some information. And the more information we gather, so that, as I say, that a lot of these measures go back to 2007 when Water NZ started tracking this information. We've got a longitudinal sort of data series of information here to look at how things are changing, so we can look at some trend analysis and look at how things are improving throughout the service sector. So that's one reason for providing this on an annual basis, and then each year that report will be published and the raw data will be available so we can track this year on year. Right, hopefully that answered your next question. We move to the next slide. Again, there are some. Sorry, please, Isabel. Yeah.
So I'd say for recycled water on a golf course, that would be the measure which records volume for non-residential use. For irrigation purposes, it depends a bit on why the wastewater is irrigated. So your typical discharge to land, that would be captured under the wastewater measures. If you're using it as irrigating it for beneficial reuse, then it gets captured under the recycled water volume questions.
Yep. Thank you for clarifying that. Yes. Hopefully that answered your question, Helen. And again, if you've got any questions, pop them in the chat throughout this webinar, or feel free to contact us at any time. Hopefully the email address you received for some of this correspondence is measures@taumataarowai.gov.nz. That inbox is always managed, and any questions that come through relating to measures and the reporting, drop it through to measures, and one of the team will respond to your email. Or I think my phone number is on that email address as well, so feel free to drop us a line if you've any questions at any point. And this is a process. We understand that the process is starting now. We're trying to prepare you for the 1 July, and then from 1 July through to the end of September, we've got a number of webinars set up to help you with that reporting. So in July, we'll have another couple of webinars to talk specifically about how to fill in the data template, how to send it to us, and we'll have drop-in webinars throughout August and September, and those will be up on the website fairly soon. So we're in for the long game. We're here to support you throughout that process up to the end of September, which is when the reporting should be completed by. So critical assets, we asked a question last year about assessments for critical assets, and moving on from there, emergency response planning and preparedness. There are a number of questions there. We've obviously seen emergency responses could be in response to natural or man-made events, but having a plan, having an emergency response plan developed and ready and available and tested makes us more resilient. So there are questions there about, have you got a plan? Provide some details about the plan. When was the last time the plan was reviewed, and when was the last time that an exercise was conducted? And likewise for a business continuity plan, has it been developed, has it been reviewed, and has an exercise been conducted? So that talks about our resilience and readiness. And water security obviously is a key area now. We're looking to address issues for water supply in future, both for today and for the future, water supply and demand. We know that a number of operators have implemented or have programs to implement restrictions or various levels of restrictions, or in some cases outdoor use is banned across networks. So please provide a bit of information and context around that. So there are different levels of restrictions which are imposed, so please tell us a little bit more about that again in the measures and in the comments. Just gives a little bit more of context around what those measures were and why they were imposed, if at all. Okay, moving on, so economically sustainable measures. So all of these are new, noting that the last one there is not required for non-council organisations. So the revenue received may come from other sources, not from rates and water meters. But the rest of those measures broken down into key areas there. So what was the actual expenditure for this year? So for the reporting year 23-24. And that's either spent on capital, either to meet additional demand or to renew and repair existing assets to maintain the level of service, or looking at your operating expenditure, OPEX. So that's for this year. And then there are similar questions for next year. So what's your forecast drinking water CapEx for next year, 24-25, and what's the forecast OPEX for that period there? So it's looking backward and forward to give an indication of in economic sustainability. As I say, that last point there, revenue received, is something that councils are required to provide, but non-councils are not required to, given the nature of their funding structure. Okay. If there are no other questions on drinking water, we'll move on to wastewater measures, which, as Isabel said, are all new this year. And these are broken down into a couple of categories there. So similar to what is a drinking water network, what is a wastewater network? This essentially is the infrastructure that processes, treats, stores, and discharges treated wastewater, and the pipeline distribution system and everything in between it, including a wastewater treatment plant. There's a little bit more detail there to break down into what is a wastewater treatment plant, which is essentially a centralized system to treat wastewater. And there are various processes that go on at different types of plants. So operators need to report on their wastewater treatment plants and networks. However, the example given there as a long drop is what we'd call a discrete on-site self-contained wastewater system. So this is something that is self-contained. It doesn't have a distribution field outside the boundary. It has a very, very minimal environmental impact. So this is something which we're not looking to go down to that level of detail. We're talking about municipal wastewater systems networks. Likewise, if you've got a septic tank where septage is temporarily stored, it's retained, there's no seepage into the surrounding soil. If it's 100% contained and then a truck comes along, a suck and truck, that is then taken off to a separate wastewater treatment facility. So that's taken off and it's then included as wastewater, which is being imported into a wastewater network. So because it's not being treated there, it's not included because it's processed elsewhere. So those are kind of the two instances, and we'll talk a couple more about some of those FAQs at the end about some examples of where you wouldn't have to report on these, but all the large municipal wastewater treatment networks would need measures reported on. So we'll look at those measures next. We've broken them down into a couple of categories. These are all measures which we consulted on back in 22, and we've taken on board feedback. We're introducing these in a couple of phases there. So the static measures, which we're looking to be reported as at 1 July, how many plants, how many pumps, how many pipes and connections do you have? So that's relatively static information. It may change over time, but the more information we get, the more we can build up a picture of the water services across the whole of Aotearoa New Zealand. Again, like for drinking water, we would want information about your resource consents, or for those operators that have trade waste permits, it's looking at information about what type of consent you've got, what's included or what's excluded. Overflows, how are they managed? What are the monitoring systems? What design and capacity, and what's the receiving environment that overflows go to? So it's getting a picture of how that's managed, and likewise resilience of your critical assets. Kia ora, we've got another new person joining us. I'll just give them a quick introduction. Thank you for joining us today. So we've just got to talking about the new wastewater measures. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat function. We can answer them as we go, or we've got an opportunity at the end for more of a deep dive into those questions. There's a question that's popped up. Is there a standardized way to capture overflow data? We'll possibly cover that when we get to the more specific overflow measures. If I can just put a pin in that, we'll hold that thought and we'll maybe answer that later, hopefully. So as at 1 July, please report those static measures. So that's for this year's reporting. For next year, we need to start recording some of the more continuous measures. So the volume of wastewater which was treated. So this is where you need to have some processes in place to measure the volume of wastewater which was treated and discharged, or the volume of treated biosolids, how much and where. So it's providing more of a qualitative data moving forward. Likewise for overflows, what are the number of blockages which were caused? So it's tracking those as they go. We don't use the term dry weather and wet weather. We're not NIWA. We don't talk about the weather, but we talk about the cause of the blockage. So a blockage could be caused, sorry, an overflow could be caused either by a blockage or by a breakage, or by overflow caused by capacity, such as stormwater ingress. So we try to use those terminologies a little bit differently to how other people may have used them in the past, to focus on what's the root cause, because how you may respond to that may be different. Moving on to reliability, we'll talk about the age and condition of the pipes and the time it takes to attend and fix faults. Energy use is quite a significant factor with a lot of wastewater treatment plants, and also emissions. So tons of CO2 equivalent from the emissions such as methane and associated gases. So it's getting a bit of a picture of what's again, the environmental impact due to those emissions. So if we start looking at the measures themselves, on the next slide, we've got a number of measures here. So we're looking at, again, asset data. How many wastewater pump stations have you got? Length of pipes in kilometers. And then we split those pipes down so there are different types of pipes. There are some people who have combined wastewater and stormwater pipes which run side by side. So that's of key interest. There are also some pipes which are either positively pressurized. So you'll have to sort of pump wastewater uphill, or some have vacuum pipes which again pump it by drawing it uphill. If you can provide that sort of level of detail, it gives more of a picture across the country. Number of wastewater treatment plants and the level of treatments. So what are the treatment process is the highest level, and there's descriptions of what's a primary treatment, secondary, tertiary. They're all included in the definitions in that guide, and also there are some notes in the data reporting spreadsheet where it specifically talks about what information is required where. And where does that wastewater go to? So does it go to land? Does it go to sea? Does it go to rivers? There are various things. And for each one of these measures, there's a number of pick lists that you can sort of pick some. So rather than having to type the answers in, you go to an Excel spreadsheet, click on the arrow in the top right-hand corner, and there's a list you can pick from. Does it go to land, marine environment, rivers, or some various things there? So the next section for wastewater network connections, again, there are a number of measures there which are required for councils, but these ones are not required for the non-councils. Again, residential connections and non-residential connections are not applicable. So some of those only need to be required for those measures. So if you switch to the next slide, I'm going through these quite quickly, but I'm conscious that you probably want to get to the Q&As at the end, so you can read this document in your own time, but we'll allow more of an opportunity for questions. So questions similar to drinking water around resource consents. Are overflows recorded? So this will possibly talk a little bit to the question we had earlier, wastewater overflows, so EH27. How do you record overflows? Is it through verbal reports, or is it automated SCADA monitoring, or through hydraulic modelings? Is it someone going around counting the number of manholes that have popped up in the street? So there are different approaches depending on what systems you've got in place there to try and capture that. There are also a number of different approaches to consents for wastewater overflows. So that again might possibly talk to because different regional plans will have different approaches to what's either permitted, controlled, not permitted. So that detail is included for overflows under the resource consents section. I won't go through the rest of these in too much.
Sorry, just to add to that as well, and noting the question on a standardized way to capture overflow data. So we have taken initially the Water New Zealand NPR approach of asking for data on overflows as it's currently recorded. In the future, we are looking at how we can standardize how overflows are recorded, and also making sure we have a standard definition so that we're comparing apples with apples across the country. But we know that's quite a lot of work. So that's something for the future. It's not right now. For now, we just want to get a picture with whatever data that is currently being recorded.
Yep. Yeah, and it's an evolving process as we capture more details and more data, we can build the conversation. The next slide, we'll talk a little bit about how we report. As I say, there is a webinar coming up in July, where we specifically go through how to fill in the Excel template. So we'll send you a reminder on 1 July to say, start reporting. The new template will be available on the website for you to download. And between 1 July and 30th September, we ask you to fill that template in. We'd ask you to fill in one template for your organisation. As I say, if you're providing information across your whole organisation, we don't want multiple versions of that spreadsheet coming in. The way our data process works, that spreadsheet comes in and it automatically gets uploaded into our database. If you send a second spreadsheet in, and that could happen for various reasons, it overwrites the earlier one. So we've archived the first version and now the second version is considered the latest best data. So if an organization sends in 3 different spreadsheets, we will only be looking at the latest data. So please work together across your team to fill the one spreadsheet in across that. There's an opportunity within the spreadsheet to, it's all the measures are listed. You can tag people's names against them. So if I want different people to provide different information, I can tag different members of the team across my organization to fill data in. So please provide that once. As soon as it comes in, we'll give it a check and we'll come back to you with a confirmation to say, thanks, it looks okay, or we think there may be some issues here. And also, if we go through and do some more quality sort of verification, we may come back, and we came back to a number of operators last year to say, the number you've given us here seems a little bit out of range here. Did you use meters instead of kilometers? It's an easy mistake to make. Do you want to just reconfirm and resubmit that data if you think that this is something you want to update? So the drop dead date is 30th September. I know we offered a number of extensions last year, but 30th September is the due date. I'm just going to have a quick look at the question that's just come in. So, question here about the spreadsheet accommodating multiple water and wastewater networks. So there's one spreadsheet this year. We haven't got a one for drinking and one for waste. We're combine them together, but there are a few different pages. So some of the information is across the whole of your organization, your council or government department, and then the individual networks are on a separate page. So you might have 3 networks, you would enter data for 3 different networks and the measures against each one of those for the individual networks. Likewise, there's one whole of organization for wastewater, and if you operate multiple wastewater, there's a simple row. It's a lot easier than last year. We've taken on board your feedback and we've tried to make it much easier to say, for this network, these are the responses. For this network, here's the answers. So hopefully it's a little bit easier for people to fill in this year. On the next slide, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Bella, and she can.
Kia ora koutou. Just keen to sort of pop up and introduce myself really. So I'm the new systems reporting manager. So I've recently started late April. I've come over from the Office of the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment. So I'm sort of in the beginning stages of planning the reporting cycle for these 2, for the Network Environmental Performance Report for next year. So I just wanted to kind of mention, you know, as kind of Isabel and Eddie have touched on, you know, this report is all about the environmental performance of networks, and that kind of encompasses a range of outcomes, like looking at efficiency, reliability, resilience, and economic sustainability. The data, you know, is there's all this measures data coming in, and that's going to be really vastly helpful to look at some of those as metrics to kind of gauge, you know, how well we're meeting those outcomes. But you know, really, it's an opportunity. Just throwing an opportunity out there. If you have any further context that you would like to provide us, you know, in words or having a chat, we'd really value hearing about that. You know, there's an opportunity for Taumata Arowai to highlight best practices. So this might be something like, you know, an approach to fish passage, or it could be an approach to, you know, to improving environmental outcomes around wastewater overflows or similar. So that's kind of hard to do in the kind of black and white questions that you might be filling in on the template, but you're very welcome to kind of get in touch, and a good way to initiate that conversation is through the measures email address that Eddie's got on this page. Likewise, on the other side of the coin, if there's any further context you'd like to provide that relates to a risk or an issue, either at the individual kind of performance level or a system level, you're very welcome to get in touch to kind of give us a little bit more context around that. So yeah, just to pop up and say hello and kind of give you that little bit more of context. Thanks, Eddie. Over to you.
Thanks, Bella. So to help you through this, there are a number of resources, and these are all available on the website. There should be a link in the email that you received, and the next email should link you to this as well. So the first document there with the blue squiggle on the front is the measures and guidance document 2024. There are previous archived versions down the bottom of the web page, but please just refer to the one at the top there, and that's all the measures with descriptions and guidance and how to and when to. So that's the detailed version. If you want to go to the summary table, there's also a summary of the measures provided, which just lists all the measures which are required. All of that information is available on the website, and as we said before, the measures at Taumata Arowai is the key email address for you to contact us. So on the next slide, spoiler alert, the template is coming soon. So 1 July, that template will be available. We're hoping to provide more support throughout that process. As in mid-July, we'll have another webinar, and there will be drop-in sessions throughout August and September. So all of those, like you did today, go to the website, pop your registration details in there, and feel free to join us for any of those questions and sessions coming soon. We've had a number of frequently asked questions which people have previously asked. We'll go over these briefly, as they might sort of explain some of the points we talked to earlier. So there may be some instances where there are a few houses which operate on a septic tank. Is this a wastewater network? No, because it's not part of a network, because the waste is self-contained. It doesn't leak anywhere. It doesn't go into the environment. So there's no environmental impact at that site because it's trucked away to a separate wastewater treatment facility. Likewise, if you have a small package system in a remote car park, it's a discrete on-site system. It's got a very small localized environmental impact. So we would not consider that to be part of a network. Every network is different, and we acknowledge this fact. And we've had questions that say, well, I've got a settling pond or 3 settling ponds. Is that part of my wastewater network, or is it a separate wastewater network? It all depends, but within the context of the discussions we've had with some people previously, if you have settling pond or settling ponds as part of the network, but there's an end treatment plant, so the wastewater treatment plant which handles all the wastewater which has come from across the whole of the network. If there's one plant at the end with one discharge point, so which discharges to the environment there, that is part of one network. So all the various subcomponents are part of that network, but we would count that as one single network, if that helps explain that. Again, I won't dwell too much on this next slide. For how many apartments are in an apartment block? It's one apartment block, for instance, which has one supply. But if there are 100 different dwellings within an apartment block, please, if you can, provide information. So some of the questions are the number of residential connections. If you've got 100 apartments in a block, there are 100 connections. And these would usually be rateable units for councils. So if you have likewise for split dwellings, where you may have a main house and a separate, not a sleep out, but a completely separate flat, which has its own front door, its own cooking facilities, and its own toilet pan. If they're 2 rateable units, they will normally be counted as 2 connections. And most councils' rating policies will actually have a rating against those 2 separate dwellings, and they will be usually a water charge because you've got a separate toilet pan if it's a self-contained flat. Now, give us your best data. Now, that last example there, you may have that level of granularity where you've got separate flats. Give us the best data you've got. The more you can provide, the better the richness of that information we can report on. We don't want gaps. We don't want people leaving out information or not providing information on time, because there will be a blank against your name when we come to producing the report. So we want to produce the report which gives the best information and puts everyone in the best possible light. So please provide the best information that you practically can, noting that you may have a low confidence in some of those, or there may be some issues that you want to highlight. Again, that's where the comments box, or as Bella's pointed out, tell us more about that if there are some particular issues. Things like earthquakes and storms happen, which may have impacted some of your services. Tell us about that. We don't know it unless you tell us. So please provide as much of that kind of context around any of those particular issues. So the good news and the bad news stories, the best practices are important, so we can look at those and showcase those best practice examples that Bella talked about. But also tell us if there were significant impacts to your system throughout the year which have impacted some of those results, because that's the context that puts it in the best possible picture. And I think that comes to the end of the presentation, but we wanted to allow a little bit of time at the end there for people. If you've got any questions which we've not yet answered, please throw your hand up, drop them into the chat. And if we don't answer your question today, feel free to flick them through. So we'll give people a couple of minutes there just to drop any other questions in the chat facility. Or you can pop your hand up and we can let you. Can we unmute people if there's? Yep. So if there's anyone there that wants to speak now, now's the opportunity. Okay. Hopefully silence is acceptance. But as I say, after this meeting, feel free to get in touch if you've got any other questions around any of this. I'll hand back to Isabel just to close us out for today. And again, if I can just thank everyone for their time and joining us.
Yeah, thank you for joining us. As Izzy said, reach out if you've got any questions at the measures inbox. We're happy to answer questions, happy to set up time to talk individually if that's useful. Liana's just put in the chat that email address. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Hopefully speak again soon.